I was halfway through my morning coffee and only one bite into Fritz's sourdough toast when the brownstone's doorbell let out a note that didn't belong. It wasn't the brisk, businesslike press of a delivery man or the confident jab of a regular client. This was a tentative ring, hesitant, like the finger on the button wasn't sure it had the right address. I gave it a minute, waiting for the sound of retreating footsteps, but they didn't come. Whoever it was had decided to stand their ground. Since Fritz was in the kitchen orchestrating something elaborate for lunch, and Wolfe hadn't yet emerged from his morning session with the orchids, I took it upon myself to investigate. The man on the stoop looked like someone who belonged in an accountant's waiting room. Slim, sharp features, hair combed into a style that was ambitious for his age, and a suit that wasn't new but was too carefully pressed to be accidental. His left hand clutched his hat as if it were a lifeline, while his right kept fussing with the middle button of his jacket. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. "That's me," I said, "and you're at the right address if you're looking for Nero Wolfe, though he doesn't make house calls in case you were hoping." He offered a small nod, lips tight. "I was told to come here. May I?" I stepped aside and let him in. His shoes squeaked against the tile in the hall, a sound I didn't care for. Inside the office, I motioned to a chair. He sat with a kind of stiffness that made me wonder if his tailor had stitched him into that suit. "My name is Edwin Lorimer," he began. "I've been advised you might help me with a matter of discretion." I leaned back in Wolfe's chair. He wasn't present, which meant the warm-up fell to me. "Discretion we've got in stock. Comes by the crate." "What's the matter, Mr. Lorimer?" He ran a hand over his forehead. "Something has been taken from me, not stolen in the ordinary sense. It wasn't an object of monetary value, but its absence threatens my position, my reputation." That was vague enough to be a speech in a church basement. I kept my face polite. "All right, what's missing?" Instead of answering directly, he opened his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and revealed that the middle button of his suit was gone. The hole gaped slightly, edges frayed, as though the button had been wrenched off. "You'll forgive me," I said, "if I don't faint?" His jaw tightened. "It matters more than you think. Now I've had people try to hire us for lost cats, estranged fiancés, and once a missing fountain pen that turned up in the couch cushions. But Lorimer's urgency wasn't the rehearsed kind. He was sweating over that absent button like it held the key to his soul. He leaned forward. "That button was removed yesterday during a meeting I attended. I don't know who did it or why, but it wasn't an accident. The implications, if it circulates, could be disastrous. I was told Mr. Wolfe has a reputation for untangling such matters." "You were told right," I admitted. "But Mr. Wolfe's time is priced on the luxury market. Missing buttons don't usually open his appetite." At that moment, Wolfe made his entrance. He filled the doorway with his usual gravity, wearing his brown silk robe like it was stitched from the Magna Carta itself. He moved with the pace of a man convinced the earth would adjust its orbit to accommodate him. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, eyes narrowing on our visitor, "you will kindly not disport yourself in my chair." I hopped out, not wanting a lecture. Wolfe settled himself, gestured at the client, and said, "Explain." Lorimer repeated his tale, this time more carefully, as if aware the stakes had risen. Wolfe listened without interruption, his lids half closed, hands resting on the chair's arms like immovable weights. When Lorimer finished, Wolfe opened his eyes fully. "You attribute significance to the theft of a button," he said, "yet you hesitate to explain why." Lorimer swallowed. "Because I cannot, not yet. I only know that if that button is in the wrong hands, the consequences will extend beyond me. I can pay your fee." "Name it." Wolfe's lips pursed. I've seen that look before. It's the one that means He's heard something preposterous, but is willing to entertain it, if only to test its flavour. "I will not stir from this chair for a button," Wolfe said, "but curiosity compels me. Mr. Goodwin will take what you provide: names, circumstances, descriptions. He will investigate. Meanwhile, you will return here tomorrow at 6 o'clock with candour, or the matter ends." "Agreed." Lorimer's relief was visible. He nodded eagerly. "Agreed." After he left, the brownstone seemed to settle back into its usual silence. Wolfe shut his eyes again. "A button," I said, "of all the oddities." "Phooey," Wolfe murmured. "A button is a token. What it secures, what it represents, that is the matter. Someone seeks to demonstrate possession. We shall discover who and why." I asked him if he wanted me to start the legwork immediately. He shook his head, already drifting into that half-slumber that meant I was dismissed. So there it was. A man walks in, missing one button and half his composure, and somehow Wolfe is interested, which meant that before the week was out I'd be knocking on doors and stirring pots I hadn't asked to stir. And if you think a button can't tie up a man's life in knots, you haven't spent much time around Nero Wolfe. When I came down the next morning, Fritz had a look that meant breakfast was going to be a ceremonial affair, not just a meal. He had rolled out a pan of popovers that were practically steaming like stage props, with strawberry preserves in a cut-glass dish that probably hadn't seen daylight since last Christmas. I sat, gave him a nod of appreciation, and did justice to the spread. Wolfe was still upstairs with his orchids, which meant I had 30 to 40 minutes before he waddled down with the gravity of a man prepared to command the world. It gave me time to think about our client. Edwin Lorimer, buttonless and fretful, had departed the brownstone yesterday, leaving behind more smoke than flame. He'd promised to return at 6 sharp tonight with candour, which meant I had less than a day to prepare a welcome mat for candour when it arrived. Trouble was, I didn't know which doors to knock on first. Wolfe's instructions had been things like names, circumstances and descriptions. He hadn't bothered to provide a shopping list because he expected me to improvise. I'd learned long ago that he liked me to stumble a little in the dark. It made the contrast sharper when his brilliance eventually lit the room. By 10 o'clock I was behind the wheel, heading downtown to an address I'd wrangled from a discreet phone call to a contact at the firm of Lorimer and Bardsley, a law office. That already explained the starch in his spine. The man was a partner in a small but well-kept legal outfit, not big enough to be top-tier, but big enough that a missing button in the wrong place might indeed rattle some cages. Their offices were on the 12th floor of a building with more granite in its lobby than most quarries hold in reserve. I stepped out of the elevator and into a reception area that smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale ambition. The receptionist, a brunette with horn-rimmed glasses, asked if I had an appointment. I gave her a smile and said I was following up on a personal matter for Mr. Lorimer. Her hesitation lasted exactly long enough for me to note she'd rather not cross Edwin's authority. She pointed me toward his office. The office door was shut, but voices filtered through. I knocked and entered. Lorimer was there, his suit jacket buttoned at the top and bottom, middle still conspicuously absent. Across from him sat a man with silver hair, and a permanent squint from his partner, I guessed. Papers were strewn across the desk, but both men looked up as if I'd just interrupted a debate over whether to bury a body or sue it. "Mr. Goodwin," Lorimer said, rising too quickly, "this is my partner, Mr. Bardsley." Bardsley gave me a look that suggested he filed strangers under nuisance. He didn't rise. "I won't take more of your time than necessary," I said, making myself comfortable in a chair that had been designed to discourage comfort. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe, gathering background." Bardsley's eyebrows twitched. "Nero Wolfe? You're detective? What has Edwin gotten himself into?" Lorimer's hand shot up like he was trying to dam a river. "It's nothing of concern, Bardsley, a personal matter. Please, allow me." That was my cue to keep things vague. I asked about the meeting yesterday, where the button had made its untimely exit. Lorimer looked caught, as if he hadn't expected me to know. I let the silence hang until he spoke. It was a meeting with 3 other parties.
Confidential. I can't confidential, I cut in. Mr. Lorimer, I'm not asking you to publish it in the Times. Just give me the roll call. Wolfe doesn't waste time on half-truths. Bardsley leaned back, steepling his fingers. This isn't like you, Edwin. If you're engaging private detectives, perhaps you ought to... Enough, Lorimer said, sharper now. Archie, I'll tell you what I can. The meeting included myself, a client, and 2 consultants. The matter concerned a pending corporate merger. Sensitive information. One of them may have taken the button. Names, I said. He hesitated, then scribbled 3 on a pad and handed it over. The client, Martin Kellerman. The consultants, Joan Adler and Victor Nash. I pocketed the note. I didn't get much more out of him. Bardsley was glowering like a man with ulcers and suspicions, so I excused myself. On the way down in the elevator, I thought about those names. None rang bells, but New York had a way of shaking bells hard enough once you pulled the cord. By mid-afternoon, I had made progress. Joan Adler, consultant, had an office near Gramercy. The secretary who tried to screen me was polished, but not immune to charm. 5 minutes later, I was in Joan Adler's presence. She was mid-30s, stylish without being flashy, the kind of woman who could make a conference table feel like her living room. She offered me coffee, which I declined, and asked what this was about. I gave her a version of the truth. Edwin Lorimer had misplaced something during yesterday's meeting, and Wolfe had been retained to look into it. She tilted her head, amused. A button? That's what this is about? Her laughter was light, but not careless. If Edwin thinks I pocketed his tailoring, he's more paranoid than I realized. She denied all knowledge, naturally, but there was a flicker in her eyes when I pressed the matter. Something had happened at that meeting, something tense. She covered it by changing the subject, asking if I often did Wolfe's errands. I told her it was more of a career than an errand, and left before she could rehearse any more alibis. Next up was Victor Nash. His office was in a building that leaned more towards cigar smoke and old money than polished chrome. Nash himself was broad-shouldered, with a handshake that could have cracked walnuts. He listened to my pitch, then grunted. Ridiculous, he said. If Lorimer's lost his buttons, tell him to buy a new suit. But the way his jaw worked when I mentioned the merger told me he wasn't dismissing it completely. I left with the impression that Nash was a man used to control, and something about yesterday had loosened his grip. It was evening when I finally got back to the brownstone. Wolfe was in his chair, beer within reach. He didn't open his eyes when I came in. Well? He asked. I gave him the rundown of the office visit, the names, the impressions. Adler amused, Nash irritated, Lorimer jumpy as a cat near air. Rocking chair. Wolfe opened his eyes, studied me. And the button? No sign of it. But I bet it wasn't just a prank. He nodded once. No, it was not. Right on cue, the doorbell rang again. This time the sound was decisive, not tentative. I went to answer it, half expecting Lorimer's nervous face. Instead, I found a man I didn't recognize with a plain envelope in hand. He thrust it at me without a word and left. I carried it in, slit it open, and handed the contents to Wolfe. Inside was a single item, the missing button, stitched neatly onto a square of paper. Beneath it, in printed block letters, were the words, "He knows. Stop him." The brownstone was disturbed, all right. And we'd just been invited to a game Wolfe had no intention of losing. The button lay on Wolfe's desk like a witness that had finally decided to testify. Only it wasn't talking. Wolfe picked it up with his thumb and forefinger. studied it with the same scorn he usually reserved for interruptions to dinner, and set it down again as if it had disappointed him. "The message is a trifle crude," he said, "but effective. Whoever delivered this intended to confirm possession of the token and to impart urgency. Pfui! To communicate with such melodrama is to betray insecurity." I leaned back on the corner of his desk. Insecurity or not, somebody wants Lorimer scared enough to jump out of his skin, and by the look on his face yesterday, he's already halfway there. Wolfe reached for his beer, took a swallow, and replaced the bottle precisely on its ring. "We must identify the sender. You saw the man who brought it? Tall, late 30s, brown overcoat, didn't waste breath on hello. Could have been a hired hand. Nothing distinctive except the kind of anonymity you pay for by the hour." Wolfe grunted. Then he was not the author, merely the conveyor. The bell rang again once, sharply. Fritz, who'd been hovering in the dining room doorway with the discretion of a courtier, answered it this time. Moments later, he ushered in Edwin Lorimer himself. The man looked worse than the day before, which was saying something. He had shaved, but his cheeks were still grey, and his collar was wilted by perspiration. His eyes darted at me, then fixed on Wolfe. "You've received it," he said. "Yes," Wolfe replied without indulgence. Lorimer sank into the red leather chair like a man collapsing into confession. "Then you understand? They're warning me. I understand only that someone has returned your property in a theatrical fashion. You will now dispense with evasions. Who precisely must be stopped, and from what?" Lorimer's lips parted, but no words came. He looked down at his hands, clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. When he finally spoke, it came out thin. "I cannot say, not yet, but I beg you to continue. You must uncover who did this. I'll tell you more soon, I promise." Wolfe's nostrils flared. His patience,
like his appetite, had limits, Mr. Lorimer. You are entangled in a contest. Someone has taken pains to demonstrate their ability to unsettle you. If you persist in withholding the nature of the contest, my services are a charade. Either you divulge or you depart. Lorimer trembled, but stubbornness stiffened him. "Give me time, I'll tell you, I will, but not tonight." It wasn't much, but Wolfe, after a long pause, inclined his head. "Very well. Mr. Goodwin has already met two of the parties present at your meeting, Miss Adler and Mr. Nash. He will proceed to observe them further, along with Martin Kellerman. Meanwhile, you will prepare yourself to be candid. I will accept nothing less tomorrow." Lorimer left, clutching his hat as though it might shield him from the storm outside. I watched him go and shook my head. That man is living proof that lawyers can be terrible clients. "Indeed," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "But he is instructive. His fear is genuine, and so is his reticence. That combination denotes not triviality, but stakes of substance." The next morning, I started my rounds with Martin Kellerman, the client. Kellerman had an office in Midtown with his name etched on frosted glass, which he probably looked at once a day to remind himself of his importance. He was in his 40s, smooth in both manner and complexion, with eyes that stayed cool, even when his smile tried for warmth. I told him straight I was looking into yesterday's meeting on behalf of Mr. Lorimer. His smile faltered only for a second before recovering. "Edwin's hired a detective? How enterprising. Was something amiss? You could say that. He lost something during the meeting. I'm trying to determine how and why." Kellerman tapped a pencil against his desk. "A button, I've heard." Ridiculous maybe. But somebody thought it worth mailing back with a little note attached. I doubt they meant it as a joke. His eyes flickered. I wouldn't know. I was preoccupied with the actual purpose of our meeting business worth millions. I scarcely noticed Edwin's tailoring. He was too smooth, too quick with the dismissal. If Adler's amusement had been genuine, Kellerman's was calculated. I left with the sense he was holding more than one card close to his vest. By late afternoon, I checked in again with Adler and Nash separately. Adler maintained her amused innocence, but let slip one interesting nugget. Nash had been unusually aggressive in that meeting, pushing points harder than necessary. Nash, when I asked him about it, barked that mergers weren't tea parties, and if Lorimer didn't like heat, he ought to find another kitchen. So far, I had 3 suspects who all had reason to deny, deflect, or downplay, which meant we were getting somewhere. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the day's harvest to Wolfe. He listened with his eyes closed, hands folded on his paunch, the picture of a man absorbing without apparent interest. When I finished, he opened his eyes. "Kellerman is the axis," he said. "Miss Adler and Mr. Nash are spokes, but he is the hub. Their conduct pivots on him. We shall concentrate accordingly." "Fine," I said. "But meanwhile we've got a button delivered with a ransom notes tone. Somebody's playing rough and we don't know the rules." "Precisely," Wolfe said. He leaned forward, his voice tightening. "And therein lies our leverage. Those who know the rules assume we do not. That assumption will be fatal to them." It was a good line, but Wolfe wasn't in the habit of throwing lines. He meant it. The brownstone was no longer just a sanctuary, it had become the stage, and the players had been cast whether they liked it or not. We didn't have to wait long for proof. Just after dinner, as Fritz was clearing the table, the phone rang. I answered. The voice on the other end was low, distorted as though the caller had a handkerchief pressed to the receiver. "Tell your boss," the voice said, "that he's meddling in matters too large for him. If he values his comfort, he'll step away, otherwise there will be consequences." I asked who was talking, but the line went dead. Wolfe had heard enough from my end of the conversation to deduce the gist. He merely grunted, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes again. "The net tightens," he said. "Very well, let them think they threaten me. They forget this is my house, and no one trespasses in it with impunity." I couldn't argue with that. The button had been the first trespass. The phone call was the second, and I had the uneasy sense a third wasn't far behind. Wolfe didn't budge after the call. He didn't rage, didn't huff, didn't even complain about the sacrilege of a stranger threatening his peace. He simply closed his eyes again, a gesture that meant the world outside his skull was irrelevant until he summoned it back. That left me holding the phone and the creeping sense that somebody had just painted a target on the brownstone. I hung up, leaned against the desk, and waited. Eventually Wolfe opened one eye. "You will proceed," he said, more vigor, more insistence. "Someone is desperate, Mr. Goodwin, and desperation leaves spore. Follow it." That was my marching order. By 9 the next morning I was downtown again, sniffing around Kellerman. The man was sleek, practiced, and busy, but no one is too busy to leave a trail. His secretary was trained to guard access, but I've had practice melting ice with a grin. Within 15 minutes I had her talking about Kellerman's schedule, in the careful tones of someone who didn't think she was saying anything useful. Useful, of course, is a matter of interpretation. Kellerman had met with Nash again after hours the previous night. That was interesting, especially since Nash had pretended yesterday that business was strictly confined to the formal meeting. I pressed gently, asking if Adler had been there too. The secretary hesitated, then said she thought she'd seen Adler leave earlier, though she couldn't be sure. That was enough for me. I thanked her, took the elevator down, and parked myself across the street where I could keep an eye on Kellerman's building. If Wolfe wanted spoor, I was going to dig until my shoes were caked. 2 hours later, Kellerman emerged, shoulders squared like a man stepping into a spotlight. He walked briskly, but not so fast that he didn't notice who might be watching. He spotted me once, I know he did, but he didn't break stride. That meant he wanted me to see him see me. He was playing a game, trying to gauge how close Wolfe's shadow had crept. I followed him up Madison, around the corner, and into the lobby of the Claridge. He made it for the restaurant. I stayed a few paces back, careful enough to pass for coincidence if he turned. Inside, I watched him slide into a booth across from none other than Joan Adler. That was worth the cover charge. Adler's amusement yesterday now looked a lot more like calculation. The two of them leaned in close, heads almost touching, their voices low. I ordered coffee and stayed put, studying reflections in the glass, catching scraps when a waiter passed. Words like documents, position, and pressure floated my way. At one point, Adler pulled something from her bag, a small folder, slim enough to slip into a pocket, and slid it across the table. Kellerman tucked it away without so much as a glance. When they left, separately, I tailed Adler. She was cautious, doubling back once, but I've been around too many corners for that trick to shake me. She ended up at her office, where she disappeared inside. I lingered long enough to make sure she wasn't heading back out, then returned to the brownstone to deliver the midday bulletin. Wolfe listened with his eyes half shut, fingers tapping his chair's arm in a rhythm that usually means his brain is tying knots faster than I can untie them. When I mentioned the folder, his eyes opened fully. Describe it. Leather, dark brown, thin, could have held maybe half a dozen sheets, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. Kellerman didn't even open it before he pocketed it. He pressed his lips together. A token within a token. Adler conveys something, whether genuine or spurious, to Kellerman, and Lorimer loses a button. You see, Archie? These are not discrete incidents. They are fragments of a single contrivance. Great, I said. So far, the contrivance has left us with tailoring scraps and cryptic notes. I'd love a little more substance. Patience, Wolfe said. Substance reveals itself to persistence. You will persist. That afternoon, I shifted focus to Nash. If Kellerman was the hub, Nash was the spoke that rattled loudest. I found him at a midtown bar, not the swanky kind, but one that sold whiskey by the inch and conversation by the growl. He was nursing a glass and glaring at it like it had let him down. I slid onto the stool beside him. "Rough day, Mr. Nash?" He jerked his head, recognizing me instantly. "You again. Don't you people have better things to do? Not when you're this interesting. I hear you and Kellerman had a little after-hours rendezvous. Talking mergers or something heavier?" His jaw set, and for a second I thought he'd swing. Instead, he snorted. "If you're Wolfe's errand boy, tell him to keep his fat nose out of matters that don't concern him." "You're both in over your heads." That was a choice phrase. Over our heads? For a man like Nash, arrogance came free with the build. But there was more behind it. Fear, maybe. He finished his drink, slammed a bill on the bar, and stomped out. I let him go, content that his bark had said more than he intended. By evening, I was back at the brownstone, handing Wolfe my notes. He was in one of his moods, half listening, half lost in the mysteries of his beer glass. When I got to Nash's little outburst, Wolfe smiled faintly. "Over our heads," he repeated, a telling slip. "Mr. Nash believes the contest to be beyond my comprehension. Admirable. He is mistaken." Before I could answer, Fritz appeared with a tray, but instead of canapes or beer, he was carrying an envelope. He said it had slipped under the front door not 10 minutes earlier. I opened it. Inside was another note, the same block letters as before. "Withdraw now. The next token will not be so harmless." Wolfe read it once, then let it drift onto his desk. So, they escalate. I asked him if he wanted me to call Saul Panzer to get another set of eyes in the field. He shook his head. "Not yet. The more they press, the more they reveal. Let them come. We will be ready." That sounded noble, but I knew Wolfe well enough to catch the undertone. He wasn't being reckless. He was waiting. waiting for them to trespass one step further, far enough that even their cleverness couldn't reel it back, which left me with the legwork, the shadows, and the nagging sense that we were circling something sharp. Every move Adler, Kellerman, and Nash made, every twitch of Lorimer's nerves, was pulling us closer to the point where somebody would break. And when that happened, Wolfe would be there, immovable in his chair, ready to pounce with words sharp enough to cut deeper than knives. Until then, it was my job to keep the net stretched, to pull at the strands until the whole contrivance showed itself. And I had the feeling that the next tug might bring more than another button. It might bring blood. I've learned to recognize the brownstone's moods the way a sailor reads the weather. Sometimes the place hums along, steady as Fritz's copper pots. Sometimes it broods, thick with Wolfe's silence. And sometimes, though it twitches, as if some outside hand had nudged the walls. That night, it twitched. It began when Fritz called me into the kitchen just before 11. He was fussing over the spice cabinet, which, to Fritz, is about as sacred as the Vatican's relics. He pointed at a row of jars, each one perfectly labelled, lined with military precision. Only now the jar of saffron was missing. "This is impossible," Fritz said, his voice tight. "I used it 2 days ago. I placed it back here. I would never misplace saffron." I believed him. Fritz could forget where he left his keys, but not saffron. I told him I'd check the dining room, though the idea of saffron strolling out by itself was as likely as Wolfe skipping dinner. 10 minutes later, the jar turned up in the office, sitting neatly on Wolfe's desk beside his globe. I stared at it, then at Wolfe. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He opened his eyes only when I spoke. "Well, you've been redecorating with Fritz's spices." "No." His voice was flat. "Bring it here." I handed him the jar. He examined it closely, then unscrewed the lid, sniffed, and replaced it. "Intact," he said, but disturbed. "Which means somebody was in here," I said. "In this office?" "Yes." His eyes closed again. Our trespasser announces himself. Not content with tokens delivered by courier, he now demonstrates proximity. "He has entered my house, Archie. He has touched my things. Pfui." That word carried more weight than usual. Wolfe can tolerate many indignities, the incompetence of clients, the inanities of police, but intrusion into his sanctum is another matter. I did a sweep of the house, checking the windows, doors, and the basement. Everything was locked, bolted, latched, nothing broken. The only sign was that saffron jar relocated with the precision of someone sending a message. When I came back, Wolfe was staring at the desk as though he could make the trespasser appear. "They are reckless now," he said. "The button, the note, the call, each a stage. And now intrusion. We are no longer being tested. We are being warned. Warned of what? That remains to be discovered. But it will not be achieved by their clumsy theatrics. Archie, tomorrow you will press further. Begin with Miss Adler." She conveyed the folder to Kellerman. "Its contents are central." I asked him if he wanted me to call Saul after all. He considered it, then shook his head. "Not yet. If Saul observes, they will know they are under scrutiny. Let them believe you alone pursue them. They underestimate you. That is to our advantage." The next morning, Adler was all charm again when I walked into her office. Too much charm. She smiled, gestured at the chair opposite her desk, and asked if I'd like coffee. I declined. "I saw you with Kellerman yesterday," I said, passing him a folder. He seemed grateful. Her smile thinned. "You were following me? Call it professional curiosity. What was in it?" She shook her head, calm as a pond. "Nothing incriminating. Background notes, research I'd compiled for him on the merger. Perfectly ordinary." "Then you won't mind showing me a copy?" That rattled.
Her. She laughed lightly, but her fingers drummed against the desk. "I'm afraid confidentiality prevents that." Confidentiality's a popular word this week, I said, almost as popular as buttons. That did it. The smile vanished. She leaned forward. Listen, Mr. Goodwin. I don't know what Edwin has dragged you into, but this isn't a game. You'd do well to tell Wolfe to step back. She caught herself, smoothed her tone, and added, for his own comfort. It was too close to the phone warning to be a coincidence. I left without pressing harder. Sometimes letting them stew in their own slip is more effective than grilling them. Victor Nash was less subtle. I found him in his office, pacing like a caged bear. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You again? What is it now? The trespass, I said. Someone entered Wolfe's office last night, left a token. He blinked, just once, then barked a laugh. Serves him right. He meddles, he pays. Tell him to mind his orchids. His bravado was off-key. The laugh was too sharp, the words too quick. He knew something, or at least suspected who was playing games, but he wasn't about to volunteer. By late afternoon, I had enough to return to the brownstone with a sack full of impressions and not much substance. Wolfe listened, his eyes narrowing when I relayed Adler's almost slip. Good, he murmured. Very good. They cannot resist betraying themselves. Each fears exposure, each fears the others, and so each betrays a fragment. It is inevitable. Meanwhile, someone's picking locks in your office. They will not repeat it, Wolfe said. They have demonstrated their capacity. Repetition would dilute its effect. He was wrong, or maybe he was right, but they had a new trick up their sleeve. Because that evening, when I opened my desk drawer to grab a notepad, I found another square of paper. On it, stitched neatly with red thread, was not a button this time, but a small piece of saffron, sewn into the page like a specimen. Beneath it, the same block letters spelled out, "The next trespass will burn." I carried it to Wolfe. He read it, sighed, and set it down beside the jar, so they escalate still further. Very well. If they wish to play with fire, let them. They will find it consumes more than they intended. I wanted to argue, to push for Saul, or at least call Kramer, but Wolfe's tone ended it. He was immovable, set in the way only Wolfe can be when the case begins to smell like something he wants to chew. The brownstone was no longer twitching. It was bracing itself, and I had the uneasy feeling that whatever came next would hit closer than a misplaced jar. The note with the saffron stayed on Wolfe's desk like an ember threatening to spark. Fritz wanted it gone, burned, tossed. Anything but Wolfe wouldn't allow it. He said it belonged to the record, and Wolfe never let go of evidence, no matter how small or how spicy. By morning, I was pacing more than usual. Wolfe
had gone up to the orchids, leaving me alone with Fritz's breakfast spread, and I couldn't shake the sense that we were being measured. Whoever had crept into the brownstone wasn't satisfied with rattling us. They were probing, testing, and now promising escalation. That meant more was coming, and not on our terms. When Wolfe finally descended, he settled into his chair with the deliberate weight of a man who believes gravity works harder for him than for anyone else. He poured himself beer, sipped, and said, "The trespasser has advanced his campaign. He will overreach. We must be poised for it." "You're sure it's one trespasser?" I asked. "One hand executes," he said. "But whose design directs it? That is the question. The instrument is irrelevant. The mind, Archie, the mind is our quarry." That sounded good, but minds don't leave fingerprints, and I was itching for something we could grab onto. Wolfe must have sensed it, because he added, "We shall use Mr. Panzer." That perked me up. Saul Panzer is the best operative money can buy, and Wolfe doesn't spend that kind of money unless he knows it's worth it. "Call him," Wolfe said. "He will observe." Quietly, "He will learn who watches us." I made the call. Saul didn't need persuading. He never does. By early afternoon, he was at the brownstone, and Wolfe gave him the facts brief, precise, no wasted words. Saul listened, nodded, and left, promising updates. Meanwhile, I had the task of stirring the suspects. Wolfe insisted they be prodded until they twitched, and I've got just the personality for prodding. Joan Adler was first. She received me in her office again, less amused this time, more brittle. I asked about the saffron note. She stiffened. I hadn't said who the note was aimed at, but she reacted like I'd accused her directly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, "and frankly, this is harassment. If Wolfe thinks intimidation will work, he's miscalculated." "That's a funny word. Intimidation," I said. "Nobody used it but you." She realized her slip and covered it quickly. But the damage was done. She was rattled. Victor Nash was next. I found him storming out of a lawyer's office downtown. He tried to brush me off, but I stuck close until he wheeled around and barked, "If you don't back off, Goodwin, you'll regret it." I grinned at him. That line's getting old. Try a new one. He shoved past me, muttering. His temper wasn't just for show. He was wound tight, and Wolfe would call that instructive. Kellerman, on the other hand, stayed smooth. Too smooth. He smiled when I mentioned the trespass, as if he'd just heard a good joke. "Nero Wolfe may think himself untouchable," he said, "but this is business, and business has consequences." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The gleam in his eye was enough to tell me he thought he was holding the winning card. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my reports without comment. Then he gestured at the saffron note again. The author escalates. He will not stop at culinary tokens. He will intrude further. Meaning what? Meaning, Wolfe said, that tonight we shall be watched, and if fortune smiles, Saul will learn by whom. Fortune, for once, obliged. It was close to midnight when the phone rang. I answered. Saul's voice was quiet, steady. "Archie, someone's been shadowing the brownstone. Not the police. Professional. Watch your lights, note your comings and goings. Tall man, overcoat, same description you gave of the courier who brought the button. He's not just delivering, he's watching. I tailed him when he moved. Guess where he went? Tell me. Straight to Kellerman's building. He didn't go inside, just circled once, then disappeared down the street. But the connection's there." I relayed it to Wolfe, who nodded as though he'd expected nothing else. "So, Kellerman retains the courier. Obvious, but useful to confirm. We know now whose hand orchestrates the tokens, the button, the notes, the trespass. They are instruments of Mr. Kellerman's design, which makes him the guy to squeeze," I said. "No," Wolfe corrected. "It makes him the man who believes himself to be a conductor. Whether he composes the score or merely performs it remains to be seen." The next morning, the escalation Wolfe predicted arrived. I was at my desk, typing notes, when I noticed a draft of air that didn't belong. One of the windows in the office, locked the night before, was open by an inch. On the sill sat a small, folded square of paper. I opened it. Inside was a single word, written in those same block letters tonight. I showed it to Wolfe. He took it, weighed it with his eyes, and set it carefully beside the other notes. "They presume to dictate time," he said, arrogant and useful. "What's happening tonight?" I asked. "That, Archie, is what we shall discover. Mr. Panzer will remain at his post. You will make yourself visible, enough to reassure them we are unsuspecting. Let them act." It wasn't my idea of a comfortable plan, but Wolfe wasn't asking for comfort. He was building pressure, drawing them in. And if I've learned anything about Nero Wolfe, it's that when the pressure peaks, he always has the valve in his hand. So I waited, restless, as the brownstone grew heavy with the sense of something approaching. Wolfe read, Fritz cooked, and I sat at my desk listening for the next move, knowing it would come, and knowing that when it did, we'd be one step closer to seeing which of our polished suspects was desperate enough to break into Wolfe's world. The brownstone had been disturbed, trespassed, threatened. Tonight I was promised something more. And if Kellerman, or whoever pulled his strings, thought Wolfe would yield, then they'd never met a man who could sit immovable in a chair and still pull the whole world into his grasp. The message that said tonight wasn't a bluff. You could feel it in the air, the way the brownstone seemed to hold its breath after sundown. Fritz tried to carry on as usual, putting together a dinner that smelled like it had been blessed by the gods of garlic and butter. But even he was jumpy, glancing at the windows as if saffron jars might sprout wings again. Wolfe, of course, ate with his usual precision, lifting each bite like the universe had paused for his fork. Afterwards, while Wolfe settled back in his chair with a book of Montaigne essays, I lingered near the phone. Saul was out there somewhere, tailing shadows. I didn't like waiting for trouble to announce itself, but Wolfe's orders were clear. Let them act. The act came at 9:30. The doorbell rang on sharp press, then silence. I went to the door, hand on the knob, but Wolfe's voice carried from the office. Wait. I waited. 30 seconds passed. Then I opened it. The stoop was empty, but on the mat lay another envelope. No courier in sight. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, grainy but clear enough it showed me, seated at my desk in Wolfe's office, taken through the window. On the bottom edge, the same block letters were scrawled. We are inside even when you think not. Wolfe studied the photo, his lips pressed tight. Arrogant vermin, he muttered, to presume omnipresence. Pfui, I checked the locks again. Nothing tampered, nothing open. The picture had been taken from the alley through a gap in the curtains. Somebody had gotten close enough to make the brownstone their hunting ground. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was Saul. Archie, I tailed your photographer, same man as before. After dropping the envelope, he circled west and went to the same building, Kellerman's, but he didn't go inside this time. He met Adler. They spoke for 5 minutes, then split. I relayed it. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So, Miss Adler joins the courier. Confirmed. The noose tightens. Maybe too slowly, I said. They're not just trespassing, they're flaunting it. How long before they up the ante? Soon, Wolfe said, which is precisely what we require. The ante rose the next morning. Lorimer arrived at the brownstone at 10, pale and twitching. He wouldn't sit, he paced, wringing his hat. It's out of control, he said. They've shown me proof. Documents, copies of agreements, private papers, they claim to hold them. If they release them, I'm ruined. The firm is ruined. Wolfe's gaze sharpened. Ah, at last. The truth seeps out. So the button was not random. It was removed in that meeting as a token of possession, a signal that they had taken more of your documents. Lorimer flinched. Yes, papers I was entrusted to guard. They were in my briefcase during the meeting. When I returned to the office, they were gone. Stolen. I dared not admit it. Fool, Wolfe said coldly. You sought to conceal your incompetence, and in doing so, you enabled them. Now they toy with you, and by extension me. But no more. Lorimer nearly collapsed into the red leather chair. Can you get them back? Can you stop them? Wolfe closed his eyes, fingers steepled. I will. But only if you obey. From this moment you will tell me everything. No omissions, no evasions. Who had access? Who benefits from the theft? He stammered out what he could. Kellerman stood to profit most directly if the merger's confidential terms were leaked. Nash had financial interests tied to rival firms. Adler's consultancy would rise in prestige if she controlled information. Each had a motive, each had an opportunity. The only missing piece was who had the skill and the nerve to lift the documents unseen. When Lorimer left, Wolfe turned to me. We now possess the fulcrum. The documents are the true token. The button, the saffron, the photographic embellishments. Their game is intimidation, designed to force Lorimer's silence or capitulation. But intimidation is brittle. It shatters under pressure. I asked what kind of pressure he had in mind. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. We shall apply it. He dictated letters to each of the 3 suspects. Each invited them to the brownstone tomorrow evening, precisely at 7, to discuss matters of mutual concern. The phrasing was Wolfe's brand of bait, polite, vague, impossible to refuse. I delivered them personally, and the reactions told me plenty. Adler's face tightened, but she agreed. Nash exploded, swearing under his breath, but he came around. Kellerman smiled that infuriatingly smooth smile and said, "Of course, I look forward to it." By the time I returned, Saul had sent word the courier had vanished into Kellerman's orbit again, then trailed Adler to her apartment. The connections were crisscrossing like wires about to short. That night, Wolfe broke his own rule and stayed in the office past 11, sipping beer while I typed up notes. He was silent for a long while, then said, "Archie, arrange for Mr. Panzer to join us tomorrow. Discreetly. He will remain unseen until required." "You're expecting fireworks?" "I am expecting," Wolfe said, "that our adversaries, pressed together in one room, will ignite each other. It is in their nature. I need only provide the match." The brownstone felt heavier than ever as I went to bed. The trespasses had mounted from a button to stolen papers, from saffron jars to photographs. They had crossed Wolfe's threshold, mocked his security, and threatened his client. But Wolfe wasn't rattled. He was positioning, and I had seen that look before, the quiet, patient gleam that meant he was already pulling strings they hadn't noticed. Tomorrow, the suspects will walk through our door. And when Wolfe closed his eyes in his chair, it wasn't to sleep. It was to sharpen the blade he would use to slice their pretenses apart. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around, the brownstone was dressed for battle. Fritz had polished the glass. Ashtrays, the chairs, had been arranged in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk like pews before a pulpit, and I had the job of usher. Wolfe, of course, hadn't budged. He sat squarely in his throne, hands resting on the chair's arms, eyes half-lidded, a man waiting for his subjects to arrive. Saul was already inside the house, tucked out of sight upstairs, waiting in case Wolfe needed quiet reinforcement. The first knock came at 5 minutes to 7. Joan Adler. She swept in wearing a tailored grey suit, every hair in place, her composure locked tight. She gave me a smile too sharp for friendliness and offered Wolfe a curt nod. He didn't return it. I placed her in the first chair, angled just so she'd have to look directly at him. At exactly 7, Victor Nash arrived, barreling through the door as though he intended to break it. His temper preceded him. I could almost see the steam rising off his shoulders. He grunted at me, ignored Adler entirely, and dropped into the second chair with a thump that made the springs protest. The last to arrive, a few minutes late for dramatic effect, was Martin Kellerman. Smooth, polished, confident. He smiled at everyone, even Wolfe, as though this were a dinner party instead of a firing line. I seated him last, completing the trio. With all 3 suspects in place, Wolfe opened his eyes fully. He didn't speak immediately. He let silence stretch, the kind that presses on the lungs until someone cracks. "You are here," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "because you have chosen to disturb my house. That is an offense I will not endure. You are also here because you have stolen documents entrusted to Mr. Edwin Lorimer. That is an offence the law will not endure. We shall now dispense with pretenses." Nash bristled instantly. "This is outrageous. You've no right, Foy." Wolfe lifted a hand and Nash stopped, as if pressed back by invisible force. "I require no right. You intruded upon my sanctuary. That alone is sufficient. But more to the point, you conspired, one or all of you, to acquire confidential papers for leverage. You sought to intimidate Mr. Lorimer with tokens, a button, a spice jar, a photograph, amateur theatrics intended to instill fear. You miscalculated. You have instilled only certainty in me." Adler sat straighter, her eyes flashing. "You have no proof." "I have an observation," Wolfe replied. "Archie?" I pulled from my pocket the envelopes, the buttons stitched to paper, the saffron specimen, the photograph. I laid them on the desk in sequence, each a stone added to the wall Wolfe was building. "These," Wolfe said, "were delivered by a courier you employed. That courier was observed by my associate, Mr. Saul Panzer, leaving this house and proceeding directly to Mr. Kellerman's building. He has also been seen in Miss Adler's company. Thus, the chain is plain Mr. Kellerman, the hub, Miss Adler, the facilitator, Mr. Nash, the intimidator. Each role
necessary, each complicit." Kellerman's smile didn't fade, but the corners of his eyes hardened. "You spin a tidy theory, Mr. Wolfe. But without the documents themselves, what do you have?" "Nothing that would stand in court." Wolfe leaned forward, his great bulk shifting with gravity. "Court is not my concern. You trespassed here. That makes it mine." He gestured at me. "Archie, if you please." I moved to the door, opened it, and admitted Edwin Lorimer. He looked worse than ever, trembling, his hat clutched so tightly it might split. When he saw the trio assembled, his face went pale as chalk. "Mr. Lorimer," Wolfe said, "these are your adversaries. You will now hear the truth." Lorimer faltered, looking from one face to the next. Nash sneered. Adler folded her arms. Kellerman stayed cool. "You lost documents," Wolfe continued, "not merely misplaced, stolen. During your meeting, while your attention was diverted, one of these individuals, or all in concert, removed them from your briefcase. The button was taken as a sign, a token to mark the act. Do you dispute this?" Lorimer shook his head weakly. "No, I know it now, but can you prove which one?" Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Yes." The room went still. "Miss Adler," Wolfe said, turning his gaze on her, "you conveyed a folder to Mr. Kellerman at the Claridge. You thought it contained the stolen papers, but in fact it contained only copies. You had been deceived." Adler's composure cracked. She gasped, then caught herself. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Wolfe asked mildly. "You never examined them, did you? You merely delivered what was placed in your hands. Mr. Kellerman required your cooperation, but not your understanding. You were a pawn, Miss Adler, useful, but uninformed." Her silence confirmed it. "Nash," Wolfe went on, shifting his attention, "you are loud, quick to anger, eager to intimidate, but theft is not in your repertoire. You were recruited for your bluster, to rattle Mr. Lorimer, to make him doubt his own safety. You played your part well too well. Your threat to Mr. Goodwin yesterday betrayed your fear." Nash surged to his feet, fists clenched. I moved closer, ready to intervene, but Wolfe didn't flinch. He merely said, "Sit," and Nash, glaring, sat. Finally, Wolfe turned to Kellerman. His voice dropped lower. "You, sir, are the conductor. You retained the courier. You orchestrated the tokens. You sought to profit from documents stolen under your watch. But you, too, were deceived. For the documents you stole were not originals. They were decoys." Kellerman's smile faltered at last. "Decoys? Yes," Wolfe said. "Mr. Lorimer, in his wisdom, or perhaps by inadvertent caution, had placed only duplicates in his briefcase that day. The true documents remained secured elsewhere. What you possess is worthless, and now your entire scheme is laid bare." The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Adler looked stricken, Nash furious, Kellerman calculating. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, as if the matter were settled. "You may choose," he said. "Return the duplicates quietly and withdraw, or face exposure. Mr. Lorimer will decide whether to pursue legal remedy. But as for your trespasses here, consider yourselves warned. Another intrusion upon my house, and I shall not be so indulgent." No one moved. Then Kellerman rose slowly, smoothing his suit. "Very well," he said softly. "You've made your point." He glanced at Adler and Nash. "We'll discuss this elsewhere."
They filed out one by one, the weight of Wolfe's words pressing on their shoulders. When the door closed, Lorimer nearly collapsed. "You saved me," he whispered. "No," Wolfe said, opening his eyes. "I preserved myself. You were incidental." He dismissed Lorimer with a flick of his hand. The lawyer stumbled out, still trembling. I leaned against the desk, exhaling. "You didn't just slice them, you diced them. But are you sure they'll fold?" "They will," Wolfe said. "Fear is a potent leash, and now they know they were never holding the lead." The brownstone was quiet again. Too quiet. But Wolfe sat content, as if the battle had ended on his terms. I wasn't so sure. People like Kellerman don't retreat gracefully. They regroup. And when they did, I had the feeling the third button theory would tighten one more notch. The quiet that followed their departure wasn't a relief. It was the kind of silence that hums with unfinished business, the sense that while Wolfe had delivered a thunderclap, the storm itself hadn't broken. I knew it, and from the way Wolfe's lips pressed together, he knew it too. He sat with his eyes closed, but his breathing had that particular rhythm that meant his mind was gnawing at the marrow of what he'd left unsaid. "Archie," he murmured finally. "Fetched Saul." I went upstairs, found Saul in the guest room, and brought him down. Wolfe didn't bother with the preamble. "Mr. Panzer, continue surveillance on Mr. Kellerman. He will not accept defeat quietly. He will seek to salvage advantage. Observe him and inform me at once." Saul nodded once, crisp as always, and left. Wolfe then leaned back, eyes still closed, and said, "We have reached the crux. They will not return meekly. The true revelation awaits. Tonight we prepare, and tomorrow we conclude." That sounded final, but I've lived long enough with Wolfe to know it wasn't closure. It was the pause before he sharpened the knife. The next morning, Saul phoned in. His report was brief, but potent. Kellerman had convened a private meeting after leaving the brownstone, bringing Adler and Nash together again. They met at Nash's office until nearly dawn. Tempers flared, voices rose. At one point, Adler left in tears. Kellerman had been seen pounding the desk, shouting something about the originals. When I relayed this, Wolfe opened his eyes, as expected. They believed they held substance. They now suspect otherwise. Their quarrel will reveal the truth. By mid-afternoon, a messenger arrived differently from the first courier. He handed me an envelope addressed to Wolfe, then disappeared without a word. Inside was a single sheet, a typed note offering to return the papers and end the matter if terms could be agreed. I showed it to Wolfe. He read it once, folded it carefully, and said, "They break. It is time." At 6 that evening, Wolfe summoned Lorimer again. The poor man shuffled in, gaunt and hollow-eyed. He perched on the edge of the red chair, trembling as though expecting the floor to vanish beneath him. "Mr. Lorimer," Wolfe said, "your tormentors weaken. They have confessed by implication. You entrusted your firm's fate to duplicity. And now the duplicity is theirs. Tonight you will witness their exposure." Lorimer stammered. "How will you fouet? You need not concern yourself. Mr. Goodwin will fetch them. They will return. And this time they will not depart with smugness." That was my cue. I made the rounds again. Adler, pale but composed, gave in at once, perhaps too quickly. Nash roared but followed. Kellerman smiled with an icy calm that told me he thought he still had cards hidden. By 7:30, all three were once again arrayed in Wolfe's office. The same semicircle, but the air thicker, the tension raw. Wolfe opened his eyes. His gaze swept them like a searchlight. "You return," he said softly, "because you have no choice. You attempted intimidation. You attempted theft. You attempted deception. And now you attempt negotiation. Each attempt fails because you do not understand the nature of your error. Shall I tell you?" None answered. Wolfe continued. "You imagined that possession of documents conferred power, but documents are mere paper. Power lies in knowledge of people, of motives, of frailties, and that, gentleman and lady, you lacked. Kellerman leaned forward, smiling. You speak prettily, Wolfe, but we have what matters. Without those papers, Lorimer cannot stand. His firm collapses, his reputation dies. Unless he yields to your terms, Wolfe finishes for him. Yes. That was your plan, a simple extortion wrapped in theatrics, but fatally flawed. Kellerman's smile thinned. How so? Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Because the papers you stole were never original? They were copies, bait placed in the briefcase for precisely such an attempt. The true agreements remained secure. Mr. Lorimer did not know this, but his partner, Mr. Bardsley, suspected treachery. He substituted the duplicates without informing him. Thus, you have spent your energies brandishing forgeries. The room erupted. Adler gasped, clutching the armrest. Nash cursed, pounding his fist. Kellerman froze, his mask cracking. You lie, Kellerman hissed. No, Wolfe said calmly. I do not. I confirmed it this afternoon with Mr. Bardsley. He had not trusted your discretion, Lorimer. He protected the firm by ensuring that what might be stolen would be worthless.
You, Mr. Kellerman, have been waving scraps while believing them daggers. Kellerman shot to his feet, colour draining from his face. This is absurd. You can't prove pfui, Wolfe said. Louder now, the word ringing like a gavel. I need not prove. You already have. By your desperate attempts, by the notes, by the trespass, by the message you sent today begging for terms you have confessed. If you truly possessed value, you would not negotiate, you would dictate. Your plea betrays you. The silence that followed was absolute. Adler looked shattered, realizing she had been used. Nash's fury curdled into shame, and Kellerman stood trembling, his smooth facade crumbling at last. Mr. Lorimer, Wolfe said, turning his head slightly, you've witnessed enough. These three sought to ruin you. They failed. You may now choose to expose them to the law, or allow me to ensure they withdraw in disgrace. Which shall it be? Lorimer's voice was faint. The law, he whispered. They must face the law. Wolfe nodded once. So be it. Archie, that was my cue. I stepped into the hall and signalled. Moments later, Inspector Kramer himself entered, grumbling but alert, accompanied by two detectives. He'd been cooling his heels in the dining room at Wolfe's invitation, a surprise Wolfe had not shared even with me. Here's your parcel, Inspector Wolfe said. 3 conspirators guilty of theft and attempted extortion. You will find ample testimony in their own words tonight. Kramer looked stunned, then barked orders. Nash exploded again, but the cuffs shut him up. Adler broke down, sobbing quietly. Kellerman tried one last smile, but it was hollow, the kind that breaks before it reaches the eyes. When they were gone, Lorimer turned to Wolfe, tears brimming. You saved me. You saved the firm. Wolfe waved him off. I preserved my peace. Your salvation was incidental. You may thank Mr. Bardsley for foresight, not me. Now go, do not return. Lorimer stumbled out, gratitude tumbling from his lips, but Wolfe had already closed his eyes again. The brownstone was quiet, the air lighter, as if the intruder's shadow had finally lifted. I leaned against the desk, shaking my head. You could have let me in on the Bardsley twist. Wolfe grunted. You would have spoken of it. And I required silence until the moment was ripe. Truth, like beer, must be served at the proper temperature. That was Wolfe's way of saying the game was over. The third button theory, as he'd called it, had been nothing more than a progression of token, siege trespass building pressure until the culprits tripped over their own arrogance. He had positioned himself immovable, and in the end they'd destroyed themselves on the rocks of his logic. Dinner followed. Fritz brought in lamb with rosemary as though to reassert normalcy. Wolfe ate with appetite, content at last. As for me, I couldn't resist a final quip. Wolf, next time someone...
Shows up missing a button, maybe we should just hand them a sewing kit. He glared at me, then closed his eyes again. Which, in Wolfe speak, was as close to laughter as he was going to give. The brownstone always has its own way of returning to silence after a storm. Once the front door closed behind Kramer and his men, taking Kellerman, Adler and Nash into police custody, the rooms seemed to exhale. The air loosened, the tension seeped away, and it felt like the house had been waiting all along for Wolfe to put things back in order. I can't say the same for my nerves. I paced the office, still wired from the showdown, while Wolfe sat heavy in his chair, as immovable as ever, eyes closed and lips pressed in that faint line that means satisfaction. It wasn't smugness, it was relief of a particular kind, the satisfaction of a man who had restored order to his private kingdom. For Wolfe, the case wasn't about saving Lorimer's career or exposing Kellerman's scheme, it was about pushing back against the gall of anyone who thought they could breach his walls and dictate terms inside his house. Fritz knocked once, then entered with a tray of beer for Wolfe and coffee for me. He didn't speak. He never does when Wolfe is in that post-case state of deliberate stillness. He set the tray down, nodded, and retreated back to the kitchen, probably to work through his own relief by whipping cream into peaks sharp enough to cut steel. "You pulled it clean," I said, finally. "Not a seam showing." Kramer didn't even have time to sputter. Wolfe opened his eyes. Kramer sputters from habit. He will resume it presently. "But yes, the matter is concluded." "Concluded, sure. But admit it, you enjoyed yourself. They poked the bear, and you let them think they were winning until you had the claws ready." His lips twitched, the faintest ghost of amusement. "Archie, they intruded upon me. I required no enjoyment resolution. To permit such trespass to linger would be intolerable. That was Wolfe's version of righteous fury. For most men it comes out in shouting and pounding fists. For him it was cold precision, a disdain sharpened into logic. I dropped into the chair opposite him and stretched. "So it really was Bardsley swapping the documents. You didn't tell me?" "I could not," Wolfe said. "You would have spoken." Silence was required until the moment of revelation. Maybe, but I'd have liked to know. I had to watch Kellerman smirk, like he'd already won, and it nearly cracked my teeth to keep quiet. Wolfe sipped his beer. That was useful. Their arrogance needed time to ferment. Your discomfort was collateral. "Thanks," I said dryly. "Always nice to know my ulcer is a tool in your kit." We sat in companionable quiet for a while, me nursing my coffee, him finishing his beer. Outside, the city moved on as if no one had just been gutted in Wolfe's office. Inside, the silence felt earned. At 8:30, the phone rang. I picked.
It up. It was Kramer. He was in a foul mood, which meant things were moving fast downtown. "Goodwin," he growled, "told Wolfe he's a son of a... He cut himself off. He's clever, I'll give him that. We got Kellerman in a box. The other two are talking already. If half of what they say sticks, this'll be open and shut." "Glad to help, Inspector," I said. "I'll pass along your glowing compliments." "You do that," he snapped and hung up. I relayed it to Wolfe. He merely nodded, as if it had been inevitable. "They fracture under pressure," he said. "Predictable. Fear is the solvent." I leaned back, watching him. There's one thing I still don't get. Why all the theatrics? The button, the saffron, the photo? If they had those papers, even if they were dupes, why not just come straight at Lorimer and demand what they wanted? Why bother playing Catan Mouse with you? Wolfe set his glass down with deliberate care. Because intimidation was their tool. They lacked the courage for direct action. They believed tokens would instill greater fear than a confrontation. It is the weakness of bullies. They dress their impotence in gestures. That sat in the room like a sermon. I couldn't argue. After a while, I went to the kitchen. Fritz had prepared lamb with rosemary and a side of potatoes baked in cream, as if daring anyone to say the brownstone had been truly disturbed. Wolfe came in when the dinner bell rang, moving with his usual unhurried dignity. We ate in silence, each of us unwinding in our own way. Fritz hovered, pleased to see the rhythm of the house restored. When we returned to the office afterwards, Wolfe settled again into his chair, reaching for a fresh bottle of beer. He didn't speak at once, but I knew something was brewing. Finally, he said, "Archie, reflect on the button." "The button? It was just a symbol, a start to their circus, yes. But why a button specifically? Why not a pen, a note, a fragment of the papers themselves?" I shrugged. Because it was easy? They wanted something small, quick, something Lorimer wouldn't notice missing right away. "True," Wolfe said, "but it also revealed them. To choose a button trifle, irrelevant in itself, is to demonstrate their reliance on theatre, on superficial tokens. They lacked the substance to confront directly, so they substituted symbolism. That, Archie, was their fatal error. They mistook appearances for essence." "Meaning?" "Meaning," Wolfe said, leaning back and closing his eyes, "that they revealed their weakness at the outset. The third button was never powered. It was proof of their impotence." He fell silent again, content, his point made. That was Wolfe in a nutshell to him. Even the smallest token carried meaning, and he would wring it dry until the philosophy spilled out. I poured myself another coffee and shook my head. Well, if you're satisfied, I suppose the world can go back to turning. But for the record, if another frantic lawyer shows up at our door missing a button, I'm sewing it back on myself before you get the chance. Wolfe grunted, eyes still closed, and lifted his glass. I think it was his way of laughing, though with him you could never be sure. The brownstone settled into its rhythm again. Outside, the city churned on, full of people chasing tokens and symbols, mistaking them for power. Inside, Wolfe had his beer, Fritz his kitchen, and me my typewriter. Order was restored, the third button theory had run its course, and if Wolfe's final observation was right, that weakness always betrays itself in the choice of symbols, then the next poor fool who dared to rattle this house was already doomed, whether he knew it or not.